In just a second, I'm going to ask Pastor Halarsis if you'd be willing to pray for us to get us started. I'm just looking across the room here, welcoming each person, and I see our teacher for tonight, Dr. C.J. Harris. So looking forward to hearing from him. Let me introduce him quickly. I don't want to use any more of his time than necessary, but I'll just give you just a quick introduction to him. And actually, instead of Pastor, maybe I'll just open us in prayer. Pastor Hilaris has just messaged, say he has a little bit of a cold tonight. So Dr. Harris, I knew him just mainly from a distance when I was at BJU studying there. And so for the number of years that I was actually more undergrad and then coming up into my master's years was when I met him and knew him at that point. But my closest connection was probably when I was studying history of civilization at BJU. And his wife, who at that point was not his wife, she was my history of civ tutorial teacher. So Dr. Harris is married to a historian. He is a historian, got his PhD in church history from BJU. And then you've already been acquainted with his dissertation, hopefully, because that was our homework reading for tonight. I enjoyed it very much. If you didn't read it, read it. It's very good. It's very engaging. It's just interesting. It's a good read. So anyway, you'll enjoy it. It looks like a lot of pages, but it's double spaced and it goes fast and it's easy reading. It's enjoyable reading. So you have a good time with it. But I hope most of you, if not all of you, have already read it. As far as what he's doing right now, he is part of a ministry, a publishing ministry. And so they produce church curricula or curriculum and actually serve churches around the world. I've had the opportunity to see their ministry, visit there in person, and it's an extensive ministry and it has a lot of influence in a lot of places. So actually, they have a heart for missions. There are aspects of their ministry. Maybe Dr. Harris, maybe you can just mention a few things, aspects of their ministry that may be really helpful for you. And I've mentioned their ministry to some of you, specific curriculum when you've messaged me. So I recommend their stuff. It's good stuff. I've seen it. Anyway, I'll open us in prayer, and then Dr. Harris, if you're able to give just a little bit of a brief introduction to what you do with that ministry. And then, of course, we want to hear from you in respect specifically to this topic. So let's pray, and then we'll jump in. Father, thank you for this opportunity, Dr. Harris's willingness to serve us and invest his time in giving some of his attention to this topic together with us. Help us now. Help us to think through this. Help us to grow from it. Help us to grow in our heart for missions, our understanding of your work throughout history, and the richness and the fullness of what you've done. And I pray that you would also work out any just communication that we have here, that Dr. Harris would be able to clearly communicate with us the things that we need to hear. We ask this all in your son's name. Amen.
Amen. All right, well, it's great to be with you all today and here from North Carolina in the United States. And I am since Dr. Arnold asked me to do this, I'll mention quickly our ministry here at Positive Action for Christ. We are a publishing ministry. My job is the managing editor, so I run the different projects that are going on, different publishing projects with a team of editors here, and I also get to do some of the writing for that, which I really enjoy doing, writing Bible studies, and in fact, one on church history that's coming out this fall. And so you get to share a little bit of that today. As he mentioned, my wife is also a historian. We met in grad school and had about a 3-hour conversation about Philip Melanchthon, one of the Lutheran reformers, the first time we met, and kind of hit it off well at that point. Figured anyone that could talk about church history for 3 hours was someone I was interested in getting to know a little better. And so if you get nothing else from the lecture today, that might be a good opportunity for you to carry on those kind of conversations sometime. So looking forward to this time. Just as an introduction, I noticed in the syllabus here that you have already talked about modern missions with Dr. Patterson. I actually had him as a professor during my PhD work and had him for the history of missions, and enjoyed that class immensely, so I'm sure you benefited from that. And then last time, if I'm understanding correctly, you covered the Reformation, specifically contrasting the German Reformed and English variations of the Reformation. And so that's going to play in a little bit as well today. Also, just during the introduction here, if my volume is not good or if you're having trouble hearing me, let me know. And I have a headset I can put on, but it gets in the way of my papers if I have it on.
No, it sounds great. It's perfect. And just, I'm sorry for, this is my fault, but the last lecture we had, Dr. Collins did the Middle Ages, and a lot of emphasis, especially Aquinas. So you're you're our first launching into the Reformation.
Well, very good. Well, then, since you haven't covered this yet, I'll just say quickly, there are a couple different branches of the Reformation. You're probably familiar with this from your own personal reading in church history. But we had the Lutherans, who kind of kicked things off for us there with Martin Luther, the Reformed branch that comes in through Geneva and John Calvin, Beza, and some other names there, John Knox you might be familiar with, and then the English Reformation with Henry VIII and the different variety of things there. My topic is missions in the Reformation, and if you read through the 2 chapters in my dissertation, there are elements of all 3 of those branches that show up in that period. But for the sake of today, I'm just going to focus in on the German branch of the Reformation, so the Lutherans, and their view of missions and how missions showed up in those first couple hundred years. I did send an email this morning with a handout. I don't know if Dr. Arnold got that or not. I meant to send it yesterday and I forgot to hit send before I went home, so I apologize for that.
I will, I'm just pulling it up here and I'm going to drop it in the chat in just a second. So the guys will be able to download it in just a second.
Great. That'll just help you either follow along or it'll give you something to look back on. I'm not sure how the testing works in here, but it's always nice to have some information to look back on if you need it. So we're going to focus in today on the Lutheran Reformation. This is one of my favorite periods in church history. And so I'm excited to be able to talk through it. And missions is one of my favorite topics in church history. I actually became fascinated in church history by reading biographies like Peyton and Judson and Carey. And so the 2 overlap well, and looking forward to doing this. But before as we dive into the topic of Reformation and missions, if you look through church history books, or histories of missions, you'll discover very quickly that the Reformation period, really those 200 years from 1517 on to about 1700, there's very little in the history of mission books from those periods. One of my favorite books on the Reformation, Pat Lang here, is Dermot McCullough's book called The Reformation, A History. And in it, he basically writes off the first couple hundred years of missions and Protestantism by saying that Reformation Protestants did very little mission work outside the boundaries of Europe. During the 16th century, they were still too busy fighting for their existence against Catholics and also fighting among themselves to establish their identity. That's those different branches we were talking about. Even in the 17th century, their continuing troubles limited their efforts to imitate Roman missions. The main energy of Protestant mission work would not appear until the 18th century. And so the topic of my dissertation is why did that happen? And a lot of people point to the environmental issues, and there certainly were some of those, but my dissertation specifically focused in on teachings and theological elements and practical elements within their theology that may have been a hindrance to that as well. And so that's what we'll be looking at today, Lutheran missions, 1517 to 1706. And I thought, well, since you have not covered that yet, based off this, we're working up basically towards German pietism is where we're going to end up, and some of the fruits from that. So let's jump in. And if you have the outline, we'll start off, obviously 1517 is where you have to start with Lutheranism. That's Luther and the 95 Theses there in the church at Wittenberg, the Castle Church. And with that, Luther kicks off a movement, unintentionally, but that quickly gathers steam. And we won't go through all the history of that. You'll cover that, I'm sure, in a future period. But ultimately, the theology develops up to 1530. And 1530, the Catholics and the Lutherans have been debating, having several debates back and forth. In the midst of this, the Catholic Church has anathematized Luther, called for his death, as has the emperor at this point. And so he is not just, the debates aren't just your typical seminary theological debates. This is life and death issues for the reformers. And so the Luther, Melanchthon, and some of his other professors there at Wittenberg get together and they develop a confession of what they believe, the Augsburg Confession. And this just lays out the theology that they are wanting to present at these debates, at these different diets, these different meetings, to say this is what we believe, and this is why we believe it from the scripture, and nothing we believe is worthy of us being condemned. But as you read through these things, there is no mention of missions work per se in the Lutheran confessions early on. The first evidence of missions work that can be pointed to in Lutheranism actually isn't in Germany. It comes from Sweden. And King Gustav Vasa is wanting to send a group of people to an area called Lapland. This was off in the frozen regions of the Baltic Sea up there. And they had been an area controlled by Sweden for some time, but they had had very little interaction up to this point. There had been a break in their presence there. And so King Vasa decides to send a group up to reassert Swedish control over the area. And in that group, he sends some military people, he sends some tax collectors, tribute collectors, and he sends a missionary. And the thought there is that this missionary, Michael, would have an opportunity to share the gospel with the Lapps as they're getting their taxes collected and other things. He did not know the language. I am not sure if it is the same one that invaded Poland or not. There are a couple of Vasas. I would have to look that up, so I'm not sure. Second. Yes. So Lapland is covered in snow, and that area, in fact, when one of the authors that evaluated the effectiveness of this mission said that Michael converted none of the people and only a few of the reindeer, just in reference to the chilliness of that region. And so it was very ineffective. And I think probably as a rule of thumb, sending tax collectors with your missionaries is not going to be really effective in the long run either. So again, now we're already about 50 years into the Reformation period. Very little missionary work among the Lutherans. If you read the chapter, there is the effort in Brazil. If we have time at the end, I might come back and take care and talk about that some if possible. But again, I want to focus in on the Lutheran side. And in about 1585, the Counter-Reformation, which again, I don't think you've covered that yet, but you'll get there. The Counter-Reformation is the Catholic response to the Reformation. And, excuse me. And in the Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church is trying to push back against these Protestant movements. And one of their major polemicists, one of their major debaters is a man named Robert Bellarmine. And he brings out 17 points of why the Reformation is not biblical and is not a true manifestation of the Christianity. And in one of his points, he points to missions. And his quotation here in your paper, in the outline, the effectiveness of its teaching is the point he's talking about. And he says, heretics are never said to have been converted, either pagan or Jew, to the faith, but only to have perverted Christianity. So heretics don't rate converts, they just pervert existing Christians. But in this 1 century, the Catholics have converted many thousands of heathens in the New World, South America particularly there he's talking about. Every year, a certain number of Jews are converted and baptized at Rome by Catholics who adhere to loyalty to the Bishop of Rome. And there are also some Turks, Muslims, who are converted by the Catholics both at Rome and elsewhere. The Lutherans compare themselves to the apostles and evangelists, yet though they have among them a very large number of Jews, and in Poland and in Hungary have the Turks as their near neighbors, they have hardly converted even so much as a handful. And so this is 1585 approximately when he's sending this out. And it's a relatively fair assessment of the extent that the work of the Reformation had among, especially the Lutheran Reformation, among Jews and especially among Jews. The question about the Turks on the eastern border was a little unfair since they were at the moment sacking cities and marauding, and the Catholics weren't really going after them missionary-wise either. But they were trying to do some mission work among the Jews and overseas, as Bellarmine mentions. The interaction with the Jews and other groups partially was hindered a little bit by the idea of a punitive replacement theology that was prominent among the reformers. They believed that the Reformation was the new Israel. The church was the new Israel, and that God was actually, eventually, the teaching among the reformers that became common was that God was punishing the Jews, and that anyone outside of the church was really they had enjoyed opportunities for the gospel, but because they had rejected it, they were no longer the beneficiaries of God's grace in that area. The Catholics did have a similar view. Inside the church was inside grace, outside the church was outside grace. But they were more willing, especially with the Jesuits, to incorporate groups into the church, even without necessarily having them adopt church theology. You'll still see this often, especially in South American countries, but internationally, the Catholic Church is willing, as long as you're willing to acknowledge the primacy of the Pope and the importance of their church and have the rites administered to you, you can hold some pretty divergent views and still be considered part of the church. And that's part of the Counter-Reformation as well. One of the ironies of the Counter-Reformation is that they come out with the Council of Trent and a doctrinal statement for the Catholic Church, a catechism for the Catholic Church, but at the same time they're bringing the Jesuits in who are totally ignoring large chunks of that catechism just to get more people into the church. And in your area, so, and we think of Catholicism, this is kind of a side point, but we think of Catholicism as like a church, but really even in Catholicism, there are multiple, denominations is probably the wrong word, but I think we understand that concept. There are multiple denominations within that church, and it's not a single unit as is often displayed. And even in Reformation times, that was the case. The Council of Trent was an attempt to pull that bubble back in a little tighter, mainly to exclude the Reformation from the church. And I'm sure you'll cover some of that in the post-Reformation lectures. So Bellarmine's criticism of the Protestants was accepted and viewed as fairly damaging, a damaging critique of the group. And even today, if you read a lot of the church history, histories of missions, I have one, even Timothy George, a well-known church historian, actually quotes him at the beginning of his article on Reformation missions, and agrees for the most part with him. But what I want us to look at, though, is what was happening. And there were rumbles of an idea of missions from pretty early, even in the Reformation era. The first 100 years, you begin to hear it, but it takes it a while to pick up steam. And let's look through that a little more. I mentioned on the outline just the Book of Concord, which was actually adopted probably about the same time Bellarmine was making his apologetics against the Lutherans. But I listed on there the contents for you. That's not really important. I just wanted to show what kinds of things the Lutheran Church was concerned about during this time. But the first person that really intersects with the Lutheran Church with a strong call for missions was a man by the name of Andreas Servia. Probably someone you've never heard of before. He was a seminary professor, and they tend not to make church history a whole lot. But he was very influential in writing a book called, I have the Latin term on there, it just means the varieties of ministry within the church. And in that, in chapter 17, he writes, "The injunction to preach the gospel to all nations of unbelievers has respect not only to the apostles, but to all ages to come till the end of the world." And here he's referencing what we call the Great Commission. I'll even refer to it as the Great Commission here a couple times. That's a little, that term was not being used yet at that point. It came into vogue more in the 1800s. It's hard to tell exactly where that started, but I'm going to use it for the sake of we know what the Great Commission is. And by and large, the Reformers, and really the Catholics also at this point, but the Reformers is who we're looking at. The Reformers believed that the apostles had fulfilled the Great Commission in the first century. So when Jesus gave the command to go into all the world and preach the gospel, Luther, Calvin, Beza, Melanchthon, several of the English reformers, in their writings, they make reference to the fact that the apostles had already accomplished that task. Calvin refers to it as a apostolic privilege, an apostolic privilege that was given just to them. And so the Reformers would have viewed their responsibility more on a local level than on a universal or worldwide level. The Catholics viewed the church as already universal. There was only one church, and it was theirs, and it was covered the whole world. There were just people that hadn't gotten on the program yet. And so they might have, some of them would have agreed that the apostles had fulfilled the Great Commission, and they were just continuing to carry on that apostolic work, because in the Catholic Church, they have the doctrine of apostolic succession. And so they viewed themselves, any privilege the apostles had, the papacy still possessed. And so even if that was given to the apostles, the church still had that right. The Reformers were very strongly against apostolic succession, as we would be. And so occasionally maybe that baby got thrown out with the bathwater, as the saying goes, in that situation. The idea of missions, unfortunately, got carried out with the idea that the apostolic office had ceased, and that role of the apostolic office had ceased as well. But Servia writes this book, and he writes very forcefully. He has an entire chapter devoted to the importance of missions for the church and the role of the church in missions. And so that That gets some attention. It gets some attention among the, he's an Anglican at this point. He's not Lutheran. But it gets attention from the other branches of the Reformation as well, partially because he's arguing for the apostolic succession of the Anglican Church in this work, which the Reformed and the Lutherans would not have been pleased with, or would not have agreed with. And so from the Reformed side, Beza, Calvin's successor, responds and writes pretty forcefully against him. He calls on everyone to maintain their own pastorates and focus in on that, and even goes so far as to say that the church could leave the rest of the world to the locusts who had recently arisen from the pit, to which he was referring to the Jesuit order. He had a high opinion of them, and so he calls on them, calls on the Reformed Church to focus in on their own ministries. On the German side, the response came from Johann Gerhard, who was one of their professors, one of their theologians. In fact, his book was the standard theological work for about, I can't say for sure, probably about 75 years. That was your systematic theology textbook, was Gerhard's work. And he writes, and he gives several reasons why the command to go into all the world does not rest on the church in his day. And so he calls on he rejects Servia's argument there. And the reasons, I'll go ahead and give you the three reasons he gave. The three reasons he gave were that the command was just for the apostles. We already talked about that a little bit. The second reason he gave was that the world had already had an opportunity to hear the gospel at least 3 times under Adam. So under Adam, everyone heard the gospel, which that's true. Under Noah, and then again under the apostles. And so those 3 periods of history, the whole world had the gospel at that point. If they've chosen not to take advantage of it, then that's their fault, was Gerhard's argument, and that God is under no obligation, and he carried that on to say that the church is under no obligation if God's under no obligation to those people. And then his third point, which we'll come back to more later on, is that it was the job of the local rulers to get the gospel to their individual people. And so it wasn't the church's job to send ministers to these other countries. It was the kings and lords and nobility of those countries' job to go get the gospel and bring it back to their people. And you'll see a lot of that if you read much in the Reformation, especially like the prefaces of different works. The reformers, we call them the magisterial reformers, because they were very strongly connected with the local governments of their areas of ministry. And so there was that strong connection with government. And so it was a logical thing for Gerhard, who was under a Lutheran government, to say that those other governments could learn the gospel and bring it back to their countries. Kind of an inverted version of missions from the way we would think of it today. And so there was several reasons there that pop up that would involve hindrances to missions involved in that particular response. Servia's writing doesn't seem to have produced a whole lot of results, even in the Anglican Church at this time, although it appears that his writings did get read and distributed. He was originally from the Netherlands, and so some of his writings made their way back over there, and eventually we'll see that had some fruit as well. But as the dean at Westminster, it would have been widely read, even if that particular chapter did not bring about much results. The next thing we see in German Lutheran missions comes about by a man named Peter Heiling, and he's going to travel down to Egypt. In fact, he is one of 7 students from the North German town of Lübeck, and they go down to the Sorbonne in France, the seminary there in France. They're studying. They're influenced by some Reformation writing that is a little more pietistic, a little more practical in nature, and so they join together, the 7 of them, and decide to go overseas to missions. We don't know about much of the 7. We know that Peter Heiling traveled with 2 others down to Egypt. We're not sure what happened to those 2, but he ended up staying in Egypt for a little while, and then moving to Abyssinia, where he married one of the king's relatives. So he's now in the royal family. And while he's there, he teaches Christianity and translates the Bible into one of the native languages there. Again, not much long-term fruit that we know of from that. The records of that era in North Africa are pretty scant as it is, but the Bible is being translated and into another language, which is a great beginning for the missions work there as well. All right. In 1651, a letter is written by the Count of Truscus. I think that's how you pronounce that. I'm not sure. Count Truscus he's one of the Bavarian princes. And he writes this letter, and even beyond the idea of missions, this letter shows some of the impact the Reformation has had in Germany. And so let me read the letter, just this excerpt of the letter to you, and then maybe you give me some feedback on this, what this shows about the work of the Reformation among the German people. He says, since faith comes alone from preaching, I would know how east and south and west shall be converted to the only saving faith, since I see no one of the Augsburg Confession go forth thither. So reasonable must it surely be to obey the command of Christ, and then he says it in Latin, but it means go ye into all the world. So what we're looking at here is one of the nobility, one of the princes of the German areas here, writing to the theological faculty at Wittenberg. And what are some fruits of the Reformation we see just even in this letter that's coming out here? Those are good questions on the chat. I'll get back to those in just a minute, because that's going to come into play here in a moment. All right. So yeah, he certainly has shown evidence that he's aware of and probably read the Augsburg Confession. I don't know that too many political leaders today are reading theological creeds and confessions. He quotes at least 2 portions of Scripture in the passage here. Mark 16 version of the Great Commission. And then again, there at the beginning, he's showing some familiarity with Romans 10, 14 through 17. How shall they hear without a preacher? And the desire there that goes with that. It's just interesting that and there's some understanding, certainly some understanding on the Augsburg side, on the Lutheran side, about what it means to be a Christian that's beyond the Catholic nod to the Pope and take the rights. There's a difference there in the way they approach these things. And so the Reformation doctrine and theology has made its way all the way into the general everyday workings of the people, the government at least, the leadership, and down even to the rank and file to some extent, to a large extent. However, he sends this letter off to Wittenberg, and when the theologians at Wittenberg receive it, they compose a response and send it back. And their response basically outlines the 3 points from Gerhard, which of course was their theological workbook, their theological textbook. And so it's not too surprising that they would fall back to that line of thinking. But they also tell him that the apostles had already done the work, that everyone in the world had already had the opportunity under those 3 periods that we talked about, and that really it's not his job to worry about the evangelism of anyone outside of his borders. And so we'll pause the outline there just for a second and talk about the interconnection of church and state and the effect that had on the Reformation. This was one of the things that, as I was doing my dissertation, struck me very strongly about the missions and the Reformation. The magisterial reformers, this is not necessarily true of what we would call the radical reformers, the Anabaptists, and those groups, but the magisterial reformers sought reformation, at least in part, through the princes, through the leadership, through the rulers. And there's some reasons what are some reasons they might have done that? Why do you think they looked to the rulers and sought to see them converted as a primary part of their mission? All right, Constantine. So there was a historical precedent. They actually mentioned Constantine a few times. What are some other reasons? If you were a first generation reformer, what are some reasons you might want the princes on your side? Okay, yeah, the church was the center of the world, and the churches that existed in their time were owned and operated and paid for by the government. Certainly, if the leaders became Lutheran, the odds of others being converted was much higher. All right, and then, yeah, the idea of civil government and religion working hand in hand would have been a natural thought for them. In fact, the leadership, the political rulers appreciated an opportunity that the Reformation presented of flipping the medieval system on its head. Because the medieval system was the Pope could excommunicate a king, and the king would have to go beg the Pope to reinstate him. So the church had power over the state. And during the Reformation, that was flipped on its head. The state gained power over the church to some extent. And certainly the need for military protection against the Roman Catholic Church. We think of the Reformation as a period of theological debate, but there were numerous wars. Even some of the early reformers lost their lives. Zwingli in Switzerland died in a battle between the cantons of Switzerland. Others were definitely in peril of life because of different wars. The 100 Years' War is over at this point, but a lot of that warring in Europe still bubbled up, and the religions gave a new opportunity for that. So if the if the Protestants didn't have any armies at their back, the Catholics could just march in and take over those different areas. And that's another good point there, that the king was viewed often as a extension of the divine will for his people. And so if you were able to convert the king, you'll see this in early British missions as well. In the first millennia, a lot of the royalty with the leaders, the clan leaders would convert, and then the whole tribe would be converted with them. Obviously, that's not a true conversion in that sense, but that was a way that was worked with. So that bled over into the Reformation. And there was a major hindrance to missions in that view of the relationship between church and state. Because if the church was an arm of the state, then to send a missionary from Germany to another country was technically an invasion. A member of the government from one country is moving into another country to convert that country's people. It'd be like if a Church of England, an Anglican, would travel over to France and start preaching Anglicanism. Now you have French subjects who are subject to the French king as the ruler, but subject to the King of England as their spiritual head. And so to cross a border as a missionary in the Reformation era was politically difficult. We would see that as a wrong view of the relationship of church and state, and that's just one of the practical ways that work that out. Yeah, and I assume that missionaries still face this to some extent today. When you come into another country, it's very important to bring in the gospel and the gospel alone. As Paul said, we preached Christ and him crucified, and that was it. When he traveled, the danger of a missionary is coming in with cultural elements instead of just gospel elements. But that was intensified in the Reformation era because of this connection between church and state. And John there dealing with that there in Poland, I imagine some of those cultural elements carrying over as well. So that was a major hindrance. The view of the apostles having completed the Great Commission, this connection of church and state, certainly the punitive view of replacement theology, where now the German church viewed itself as the new Israel. Of course, so did the Reformed Church, and so did the Anglican Church, and so there was some conflict there as well. Yeah, good point, Joel. Those things happen all the time. And the Reformation era also saw some of that. The Catholic countries especially viewed some of the new doctrines of the different branches of Protestantism as an invading doctrine. You'll see that probably the two biggest displays of that would be the Inquisition in Spain, where they viewed it as such an invasion that they actually burned the books and the authors when they could get them, as really military enemies of the state. They viewed that as an invasion there. And then probably maybe in a more dramatic form, once you had the Huguenots in France, you had this group of Protestants living in a predominantly Catholic country, and there's a whole lot of political back and forth that went on, but ultimately being expelled because of their theology and their politics. and reassertion of the Catholic Church there in France, which led eventually to the Bartholomew's Day Massacre and the pushing out of the Protestants from France, taking out that middle class that ultimately probably led to the French Revolution, that it's splitting the loss of all that middle class group of Protestants split the upper class and the lower class even more. So there's a fear of the foreign that intersected with the activity of the gospel and the activity of missions. And it wasn't so much on the receiving side like it was in France. Mostly it was even on the sending side. So the Reformation countries, the Lutherans and the Anglican and the to a great extent the Reformed Church as well, the concept of overseas or foreign missions would have been a novel and difficult concept for them to coincide with their view of church and state. And it's interesting, one of the pastors here has mentioned Spain using Roman Catholicism to colonize the Philippines. They certainly did. Same was true in South America. And eventually the Protestants adopt a similar method in some of the countries as well, which again is an unfortunate marrying of the gospel with government in a way that ultimately led to some problems. Yeah. And certainly God used these things. Even whenever we get to some of the Protestant missions where they're traveling to India and other places, many of the missionaries are going to get passage on trade ships. They're going to be having opportunities to minister in places because their government has already established a presence there. And God used that. The danger with those kind of things is whenever that became a limiting factor to taking the gospel to the whole world. And we'll see that with our next person we'll come to here in just a second. The Catholic Inquisition and some of the Islamic states, certainly there was a connection there, which is interesting because the Spain itself was battling with the Islamic wave that was moving into that area for centuries. But there certainly is that idea of the government, and even in the early confessions of Lutheranism, the government was given permission to wield the sword in both political and religious matters. So if you were in a Lutheran area and you were preaching non-Lutheran doctrine, a Lutheran prince could have you arrested or even killed for false teaching, which in the more Western mindset, to me, that sounds very anachronistic and odd that a government would wield power on theological issues. But that's still the case in a lot, especially the Muslim countries around the world, where they will shut borders, they will enact judgment on punishment on people who are proselytizing for Christianity, and that is certainly the case in those different areas.
I mean, to what extent do you think? Because some of this really fascinates me. It's like part of our struggle with understanding their framework is just our framework is so different, where they're not going to imagine the idea of a secular state, a state that does its best to be unattached to any kind of religious persuasion. Like that's a foreign idea. And when I think about what we do, for a government to be, quote, secular and to try to be neutral, that in itself really is just another religious commitment. So at the end of the day, we're kind of left scratching our head. Should a government be openly committed to Protestantism, Catholicism, or secularism? Well, they're all just three different religions anyway. Um, and that maybe that's part of our struggle. But a reformer, Luther, doesn't even have any idea in his head of a secular and quote neutral, if that even exists, government that tries to stay outside of religious matters. Am I thinking the right way?
No, absolutely. Our mindset today is very different than the mindset of the reformers. But even today, we have that struggle of the church is the church, no matter what government it's under. And what happened in the reformers' setup is that the government they were under unduly influenced the church in some areas. But I think that same thing could be true in a secular government. Like here, the Philippines is a secular government as well, I believe, for the most part. And the danger there is the church acquiescing to a secular marketplace. You can have your religion in your church and in your home, but don't bring it into the marketplace because the government is secular and the culture is secular. And Luther struggled with that to some extent when they first began the Reformation. A lot of the reformers were teaching Reformation doctrine under Catholic princes, and so to some extent they were willing to buck the system a little bit for the sake of the gospel, but they weren't willing to go so far to that area in the area of missions, and so the people began to see that disparity. And when we get to Justinian, get to von Weltz here in a minute, he's going to point out, along with Servia, and I did as well, he's going to point out the need for that. Servia was still pretty magisterial in his mindset, so he was thinking spread the Church of England to different areas with this mission work. Justinian is less so, and is really setting up the kind of thinking that's going to allow the birth of modern missions that Dr. Patterson talked about. I'm assuming he covered those different areas. Let me look over here for a second. Gotta make sure I'm covering all this. Yeah. So John makes a good point there that that Christ's kingdom and the world's kingdoms are not the same thing. And that if they were, then it would make sense for the church to be militarized in support of the state, instead of militarized in the work of the gospel. And probably militarized is the wrong word there. I'm not trying to bring up the holy war type mindset, but militarized in the sake of giving of ourselves and our efforts for the sake of the kingdom of Christ. Yeah, and the counter, and that's a good point mentioned about Roman Catholic missions as well. There, they are going on during all this. So the lack of worldwide missions in Protestantism is being contrasted to a very active Catholic international mission work with the Jesuits especially, and there's some benefit to that. You hate to be appreciative of Catholic missionaries, but they were carrying pieces of the Bible at least around the world, and some of the places that Protestant missionaries eventually made it to, there was some biblical understanding, at least the basic stories of Scripture and things like that to build upon. Unfortunately, there was a lot of falsehood and wrong understanding of the gospel that conflicted with that. And so that led to a lot of struggles there. And certainly some of the methods that the Catholic Church used to bring those nations under the Roman discipline or under Spanish discipline at times as well in other countries led to some significant hindrances to the gospel when it finally did show up. So all those things, the connection with the state caused problems, but it did open opportunities as well. And for the Protestants, because most of their countries were not international players, international powerhouses at the beginning of the Reformation, that did limit, that made the connection with the state a limit on them. Whereas Spain and others, the connection with the state and the government there, or the church and the state there, gave them opportunities, albeit even that had some limits to it because they were still under the auspices of another country.
Can you tease out that correlation just a little bit? Because I found that really interesting, that the correlation that some of the Protestant countries are more limited in their resources. So is this because, what do you say, a less centralized government, let's say like in the German states, a less centralized government and less power allows then for the political cracks to break open, and that allows things to form in some of these states? Why would it be that the Catholic countries happen to have the higher resources and the places where the Reformation is breaking out, maybe not so much?
All right, that's a good point. In fact, probably the things that allowed the Reformation to take off in those territories were the very things that limited their international opportunities. Because the German states were still fractured into lots of small groups, even Switzerland with its different cantons. We think of Switzerland today as a country, but back then, and I'd had to guess, there's probably about 15 different regions inside Switzerland, each under its own ruler. And so you don't have to convert the entire country to the Reformed religion. You can just convert the area around Geneva and 2 or 3 others around Bern and Zurich. And so you have the ability to see the Reformation happen in smaller regions. Once you get down into France, and especially down into Spain, you have a unified country to some extent. You know, Ferdinand and Isabella in the 1400s have unified that whole area. And so it's a lot harder to see the Reformation spread through the whole country before someone steps in to stop it. But the very thing that made Spain powerful enough to rule the waves was that unification. Whereas in Germany, you're going to wait a while before you have that kind of unification showing up in a historical setting. England had better unification. Yeah, and England also, the Reformation there benefited from the fact that, well, number one, Henry VIII wanted to be in control, and that was a strong influence there, as well as their general dislike for Spain and France that were Catholic, and so anything to differentiate themselves there was helpful as well, especially with the Spain and France trying to take over political power in England.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
So, all right, should we take a break before we jump into the next part?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I've got right on the hour, so let's just take 5 minutes after the hour. We'll be back in 5 minutes. So.
Great.
Excellent.
Right back.
Well, let's resume. And yeah, excited to continue to hear the next stage and what we're discussing here.
All right. So up to that 1651, then we've seen a general opposition to the idea of international missions. The next big proponent, and someone I'd never heard of before and came into contact with during my research for the dissertation, was a individual known as Justinian von Welz, and he wrote 4 or 5, they call them books, but like this little book here, and you can see that book has, the first half is all a history of his life, and then it has his 4 books and the response to him as well. So really, the books are pamphlets more than books. But it's an interesting opportunity to read some things that will sound very familiar to us in a missions mind, in missions today, but written from someone in the 1600s. So the compiler and the author of the history section is James A. Scherer, 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 and just anyway, a fascinating read. And what Justinian did, and I should say before I even start that Justinian, before he wrote these 4 treatises on missions, he had written one other one that was a little bit on the mystical side, in response to some of the high scholasticism that had worked its way into the Lutheran Church at this point. The orthodoxy at this point was very much about talking about the theology and not living it, and so he called them out on that. And probably a couple things, that particular treatise is not in here, and I couldn't locate an English version of that one. Actually, I couldn't locate any version of it, but apparently there were some things in there that were a little bit questionable, or concerns for the Lutherans, Lutheran Orthodoxy. But he writes in these treatises, in the first one, he calls for the establishment of a missionary society as one of 2 branches for a proposed Jesus-loving society. Sounds great. And the other branch, so there'll be a missions branch which would go out with the gospel. The other branch he was going to call the Fear of God Preserving Society, which probably sounds better in German than in English, I assume. But the idea there was that it would work to maintain morals and religion in Germany. And so there was a branch for Germany, and there was a branch that would carry the gospel around the world. The missionary society would have 3 parts. It would have supporters who would give money and reputability to the group. So these would be nobility and people with important names and big pockets. The next group would be trainers, which would be seminary-type professors that would help train the missionaries that were going out. And then the missionaries themselves, which he viewed as probably coming out of the colleges, the younger men who were being trained and then sent out as missionaries. Again, Justinian, especially in his later treatises, got a little bit fed up with people not listening to him, and so he started name-calling a little bit. In fact, he accused those, I mentioned this here, he accused those that claimed that the Great Commission was no longer incumbent upon believers of disobeying the command to love your neighbors as yourself. And so, which I could see some legitimacy to that concern as well.
The way some of that was worded, and I'm not saying this is necessarily it's proof that it's going the wrong direction, but you would only expect this, I guess. Is he building some of these concepts or modeled a little bit after the Catholic religious orders? It sounds a little bit like a religious order just in Lutheran guise. Is that kind of his foundation, or?
I think it is to some extent, a little of that idea. And I think it's reactionary. And that's actually one of the concerns. And maybe, so there are some legitimate concerns here. That certainly is one of them. One of the other legitimate concerns that the Lutheran Orthodoxy brought up was that he would be dividing the church into 2 groups: those that love Jesus and those who don't love Jesus. And he was accused of some pride and arrogance in that direction as well. That may have been a little bit of a straw man type approach that they had, just because they didn't really like what he was saying anyway. Yeah. So, and so he probably hurt himself a little bit in that approach. But what he did do is he did bring up again the fact that the Great Commission was a responsibility of the church, and he gave his second treatise gave a pretty thorough way in which that could be carried out. He even lined out the different ways that people could be trained, how the finances could be done. So he basically gave in a seminal form, in a seed form, what we would view as maybe a missionary society today, a missionary sending agency. And so he brought up that concept, one of the earliest probably written records we have of someone with that kind of idea. He actually takes his first two treatises to one of the religious meetings and presents them to the leadership of the Lutheran Church. They are looked at and tabled. No decision is made for or against, but you get the impression they were kind of tabled indefinitely. They didn't want to talk about it even. And so that's when he goes back and starts getting a little bit scolding, as John says there. He goes back and writes, especially his fourth one, where he condemns the nobility for calling the whole thing impracticable, and anyway, he gets upset. Also, in response to his treatises, another treatise appears from the Lutheran Orthodoxy, probably written by Johann Ursinus. He doesn't sign it, so we're not 100% sure, but most people think he's the one that wrote it. And he was accusing von Welz of unbiblical innovation and pride. And interestingly, one of the things he complains about is what we would today term as a parachurch organization. And that argument's been around apparently since the 1600s. But he argues about some other things as well. And the whole treatise sums up the last couple paragraphs. He says, the end of the world's close, so we don't really have time to do this anyway. And let everyone mind his own door and everything will be fine, is his response to von Welz. And that generally was the opinion that carried over through the Lutheran Church. He tries for a while longer. Eventually, the Lutheran Church uses the state to get his printing of his books banned in Germany. And so he moves to Holland to get books printed there. He still isn't getting any kind of traction. And ultimately, he sells his title and his lands and all his goods. Not his lands, his land. But he sells everything he has. And he sails off to Suriname, where he does serve as a missionary there for a year or two before he dies. And we're not sure exactly what the cause of death was. But here, unlike Servia, who gives the idea but doesn't carry it through, von Welz does carry through on his idea. And those treatises are floating around Germany and Holland, and ultimately probably even over into England, because the Holland presses tended to drift over to England pretty freely. And some people think that Carey might have actually read some of these later on, and when he finally came around to argue for world missions as well. We're not sure about that, but we'll see. But the ideas are there as well. So Justinian, one of the ideas is that he might have gone the way of the cannibals, as John eloquently puts there. That was an end to several of the missionaries early on as well. So So von Welz is an interesting character. Certainly, if you were to read his treatises, you would find a lot of things in there that you would recognize as missionary thought today. There is still that connection to the government that's lessened at this point, but is still there. He's wanting the orthodoxy to set up this. Still wants the orthodoxy to set up this society to help with the missions. But at the same time, they're not viewing it as part of the church, so there's that tension back and forth there as well. And so there were some legitimate concerns, and then some illegitimate ideas, that the continuation of the idea that it's not our job to carry the gospel beyond our borders, which Ursinus so eloquently argued for in his disagreement there. So in the midst of all this, just in the bigger picture of the Reformation era, this is 1663, so we're almost 150 years after Luther at this point. The German Orthodoxy has become an establishment within the government of Germany, and there is a general recognition of a lack of religious piety among the rank and file of the clergy and of the people. And so into this, you have one of the groups we would refer to maybe as a second Reformation group, a further Reformation group, and that is German pietism shows up. And I just put a couple names on there that you should be familiar with in the area of pietism. Philip Jacob Spener is called the father of pietism. And then his successor, the person that kind of carried the torch when he passed off the scene, was Augustus Hermann Francke. And Spener wrote a book called Pia Desideria, from which the term pietism was coined. It was actually a derogatory term initially, kind of like the Methodists, where it was a derogatory term initially. And even Christians, frankly, was a derogatory term in the early church, intended to mock believers. But his whole point was that the theology might be good still, but it's not getting past the head into the heart or into the life. You're going to see the same impetus show up at about the same time in the Puritans in England, which I'm sure you'll cover at some point in the series here on church history. And you're going to see the same thing show up in the Reformed, primarily in the Dutch areas. You'll read about something called the Dutch Further Reformation or Second Reformation, and that is we've gotten the theology right, but we've lost the heart of Christianity somewhere in this process. We're becoming as formal as those that we rejected. We might have better theology than the Catholic Church, but we're almost as formal and hierarchical as the Catholic Church at this point. And there's kind of a call back to a practice of our religion. And so these men led that group out. Interestingly, Francke was actually born in Lübeck, where Peter Heiling and those 7 missionaries back in the 1630s, 1630s, where they were from. So apparently there's something in the water in Lübeck that was or some teaching or something there that seemed to spur on that pietistic side of things. And so this group, let me ask a question then. This pietistic influence that comes back in, why would you think that would give an impetus to missions? What is there about the pietism that we see in these kind of groups that makes missions more likely in that kind of soil than in the high orthodoxy side of things? All right, so So when our eyes are focused on Christ, there is a Christ-like compassion that comes back in. That's certainly the case. Okay, it was on a more personal level. So now you have something that's not corporate anymore, and the personal pietism had a better chance of overcoming some of the limitations of the church-state issue. Certainly the personal level can lend itself to some problems occasionally. You get overly individualized, but it does allow you to say, God has called me to share the gospel instead of the church ought to share the gospel. That's an easy way to pawn off our responsibility. All right, that anti-establishment side of things. Yeah, and I think that really is the heart of it. There's one of the Dutch Second Reformation guys that you might have heard of is Wilhelm Beckel. He actually wrote a systematic theology that if you ever get a chance to just read a little bit of it, it reads devotionally. You can imagine a devotional systematic theology, and there are quirks and things. I mean, it was written in the 1700s, so it's a little quirky at spots, and maybe a little the language a little tough occasionally. But it's a fascinating read, and there was something there of getting the eyes back on Christ and how our relationship to Him affected our practice of the theology that seemed to spur that kind of missional heart. And I find that it's very easy sometimes, even in our seminary work and times like that. When I was in seminary, you get that stack of books that are sitting there, and you're reading these things from people that have been dead for 200 or 300 years, and it's easy sometimes for the heart to get overshadowed by the work that we're doing. It doesn't necessarily happen, but it can happen, and that appears to be what was happening in those about 100 to 150 years out from the Reformation period. So God, as He always does in the history of His church, He sends in a corrective to that and stirs these things back up. So these Spener founded the University of Halle in Germany, and this university became a hotbed for pietism, and it also became a hotbed eventually for missions work. When he dies in 1705, Francke takes over, and he's going to lead the school, I think to the point of his death, but at least for several years in there. And during that time, in 1706, King Frederick IV of Denmark decides they have begun the Danish East India Company, really, a Danish trading company in India. And the king is concerned about the spiritual welfare of the people who are there. Trading companies were notorious for low morals and other issues when you get that far from home, and typically it was mostly all guys, and there are other issues anyway, it was typically low morals in those settings. And so he was concerned that they send some ministers there to minister to those people and to minister to the Indian people that they were working with. And so he goes to the colleges in Denmark. No one can help him. No one wants to go to India. But he writes to Francke there at the University of Halle and says, "Hey, I need some missionaries. He didn't call them missionaries. I need some ministers to go to India." And here we have two volunteers, and I wrote their names on here because I know I can't pronounce them correctly. But we have Bartholomew Zeigenball and Henry Pluschka, we'll say, and these two guys volunteer. They've been trained there at the seminary in Halle. They are funded by the King of Denmark, and they set off in 1706, a year after they received the letter, and they travel down to India. And the area they go to is on the southeast side of India, and they begin missions work among the Indian people. And so here we have, what is that, about 90 years before William Carey heads to India, we have these two pietist missionaries headed down to this area. And John mentions there, ironically, because of the view that the commission was given to the apostles, many of the early missionaries were called apostles. And if you read Calvin's Institutes, Calvin, when he talks about the different offices in the church, he talks about apostles and describes them very much like missionaries. Basically, they are ministers who have the world as their parish. So they have God's commission to go anywhere in the world instead of just a commission to go to their own church. And he viewed the apostolic office as ceasing with the apostles, but that he says in the Institutes that God at appropriate times may reinstate that office to send apostles back out again. He just doesn't necessarily know of that happening recently. So it's interesting. So if you ever read the section on apostles, and if you have some time tonight and you want to read Calvin's Institutes, pull out the section on the apostles, and there's some interesting stuff in there. Oh, that's very possible. I'm not sure what Latin for apostles is. But here we have, these we have then are the initial missionaries. And they end up sending a few dozen missionaries down to India from what came to be known as the Danish Hall of Mission. So it's the king of Denmark and a pietistic university in Germany working together to send missionaries to India. And by the time that Carey gets there, he goes to a different part of India. But by the time he gets there, the records show there are several thousand Christians in that portion of India that have been reached by this mission. Native Christians, not expatriates, but native Christians there in India. And it's exciting to see how God has done that. So just a couple thoughts there on that as well. Missions in the Reformation, it's a challenging thing because there really is little initial evidence for that missionary impetus. And even whenever they first start writing about it, when you get people like Servia and von Weltz, the vast majority of the clergy are in opposition even to the idea of a world mission. So certainly the environmental influences were there, but there was an inherent thinking among the leadership and the clergy that was anti-world missions at the time. And it took a long time and several people having their ideas rejected before those ideas finally took root. And certainly when Dr. Patterson covered the modern missions era, you see that those seeds and those roots finally blooming into giant trees and much fruit in those areas. And I think that's one of the elements of church history. Probably you've noticed this as you go through, is that the church has periods where, no, I shouldn't say it periods. The church is always imperfect and incomplete in its work and in its efforts. And that's why we have that hope that one day God will come and make all things complete and perfect. And we're looking forward to that. But God does use an incomplete and imperfect church work to accomplish his work in this world. And so even these individuals are working that way. With the pietist, who is more influential in the pietist movement, John Huss or Spener? Spener would have been on the German pietist side. What you end up having, Spener and the pietists are going to eventually produce someone named Zinzendorf. who you'll probably run into eventually. And he's going to set up a pietistic community in Herrnhut. And that community eventually is going to have a group of Hussites come, descendants of Huss. And that's going to be where we have the Moravian church that eventually develops, which is also a very missionary-oriented church. It's going to have influence on people like the Wesley brothers and much of, and on several elements of the Great Awakening that eventually show up. And so that's how Huss connects to the Pietist movement, is the Bohemian exiles that come there. I think the church, to that question there about the church and state versus just not thinking about countries that were far away. I think among the clergy, I think the church-state connection was probably the natural order of things, and they allowed what they viewed as the necessary way things were. They defended that way with the theological ideas of the Great Commission no longer applying, some of the replacement theology ideas that trickled in there and had some negative impact. I think that they allowed their theology to defend their what they viewed as the necessary practice of their day, which all of us are tempted to do, and probably do in some areas we don't even think of. Just things that we do, and we allow our reasoning to allow that because of, we just view it as a necessary way things go. The idea of countries like India, your average German churchgoer would probably not even be able to find India on a map, obviously. So the idea of those foreign countries was distant. But you had to remember, you had people traveling to India in the 14 and 1500s, to the Americas in the late 1400s, early 1500s. And the big thing they would do is write books. For instance, I grabbed this one. This book is by one of the Jean Deliri. He's one of the folks that traveled to Brazil with Coligny. Sorry, I'm going to anglify the French words here. But Coligny, and he came back and he wrote, this thing's about a 250-page book on the things that he did and saw around the world. And so the learned people, by the 1500s with the printing press, people who could read, the literate people, knew about the world. They knew about other countries. And John does make a good point. There is a certain level of elitism in the xenophobia of the Europeans. Even as you read Christian writers that traveled to other countries, there was a superiority mindset. Like, we have it all figured out, and these poor heathen are almost savages. Even one of the ministers in the Brazil colony said he wasn't sure that the native Brazilians could even understand the gospel. He just wasn't sure that they had the mental facility to be able to do that. Yeah, and calling them heathens, the equivalent of barbarian. I had a professor in college. I'd always just assumed barbarian meant cruel, harsh people, but apparently barbarian came from the Latin word that was used to describe them, and they described them because they couldn't understand their language. So a barbarian was anyone who couldn't speak Latin, because it sounded like they were going bar, 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 bar to the Latin ear whenever they were talking. And so there's that elitism in the European mindset that probably did some hindrances to missions as well during that point. And certainly when I'll mention this. The Danish Hollow Mission, I put this in the appendix on the back of the handout. The Danish Hollow Mission had 5 principles that they operated under. And principle number 1, that churches and schools must be developed and built together. But anyway, so when they traveled, they would teach the people. Part of that is because a lot of the native people they met were illiterate. They either didn't have a written language or they didn't know their own written language in different areas. In India, there was a written language. But the average person, the lower caste, wouldn't have been taught to read and write. And so they would develop schools. In fact, if you go to India today, you can still visit the William Carey school and college, because that was one of the things he did while he was there, was develop that also. But they would develop schools to teach the uneducated locals how to read, because their second principle was that the Bible must be translated into the language of the people. And so they would teach them to read, and while they were teaching them to read, they were translating the Bible and using that as the textbook for the reading classes. And that should sound similar. It's very similar to several approaches used today. Methods and styles of preaching the gospel must take into account the mind and understanding of the people. And I think that was, for the Danish Hollow Mission, that was a beginning of recognition of the elitism that some of the early colonial people had. A recognition that it wasn't that the native people couldn't understand. It's just they didn't understand things the way Europeans understood them. I mean, if you go to Brazil and talk about even a verse whiter than snow or things like that a German would understand snow, but a Brazilian would have no idea what you're talking about. And then the different political and economic and different things. There was a recognition that if you're going to minister to another culture, you have to at least understand that culture on a basic level to begin ministering to that culture. And that was helpful. That was one of the helpful innovations the Danish Hollow Mission brought in that helped overcome some of that. The goal of evangelism must be definite and personal conversions. So yes, Visigoths, that was earlier. That would have been the earlier part of church history. They were involved in the attacks on Rome and the sacking of Rome. And actually their descendants are the ones that made up the Northern Europeans, and the Eastern Europeans. So the people that were barbarians to the Romans ended up becoming their descendants became some of the reformers. The Visigoths were not Christians unless some of the early missionaries reached them. Some of that group, actually some of the Arians, some of the group were reached by Arian missionaries. So there was some elements there as well. Why do you think the Roman Catholic? I think the Roman Catholic Church got involved in missions earlier because the Roman Catholic countries were more involved in colonial enterprises earlier. So they had the ships that were traveling places. The Catholic Church was so intertwined with the government that it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense to have a Spanish colony without a Catholic Church in it. And so that was a natural tendency there. As to whether they were more compassionate, no. If you read some of the ways they evangelized areas, there certainly was a lack of compassion in a lot of that. Although there probably were some that did do it out of compassion. you can't broad brush the whole group based on some excesses of the group. But for the most part, it was just part of, if you were going to set up a governmental center as a Catholic country somewhere, you were going to set up a Catholic minister there who would do certain things. For instance, last rites. If you were a good Catholic in a foreign country and you were dying, you needed to have a priest there to give you last rites, or you were missing one of the means of grace that you had. Yeah, and they did follow a lot of the old trade routes. And I'd agree with John there as well, that the Roman Catholics tended to be more imperialistic in the process. The church had an empire, and each of the countries had an empire, and so you had that double empire mindset. Once the Protestants became the ones traveling the seas, it was more for trade and commercial reasons. And there was some colonial, obviously, there was still colonial aspirations. You had the British Empire and things like that. But there was definitely a difference. And part of that is it was 150 years later, 200 years later as well, and the communication was better and some other things were improving. Yeah, Roman Catholic eschatology, that's a whole other topic, but they would tend to be more the amillennial side, that the church is spreading across the world and will take over the world and will spread itself over the whole world. And they would view themselves as God's kingdom, certainly. Yeah, and when you run into the East India Company, you start having issues where the Protestant missionaries are objecting to some of the excesses of their government. You did not find that in the Catholic missionaries. They tended just to support the government because of the very, very close tie with church and state. And you really don't get the Protestant missionaries objecting until you get more of the independent missionary works. Like William Carey would write and complain about certain things that the government was doing there. Judson did the same thing, and others. In fact, when you get someone like Peyton and stuff like that, he's actually writing long articles about the government's failure to stop the slave trade and the government's mistreatment of natives and things like that. So that's an element you don't necessarily see as much nearly as much in the Roman Catholic side of things.
So here's a question, and you have every right to defer because it's stretching a little bit outside of the assigned topic. But so there's a gap here, right? So we've talked about the Reformation era and then William Carey. The big question that's stuck in my mind, the Puritans. So just what's happening there? Obviously, you've got some kind of bright light. So Jonathan Edwards, to whatever extent, we're going to make the link there as a descendant, at least theological descendant and so forth. And if I remember right, I feel like I remember reading some comments that John Winthrop made, whatever that's worth. But yeah, I mean, within the Puritan movement, what's happening there, or what is the rationale given? Is it basically the same kind of framework, the Great Commission by the apostles and so forth, or any comments there?
Yeah, let me speak to that real quickly. So what we looked at was the Lutheran Church. You could do this same kind of outline if you look at the Reformed Church, and you do the same kind of outline if you look at the Anglican Church. So you're going to have initially very few efforts, unsuccessful. So you'll have like the colony in Brazil. If you read the chapter, you read about that. You're going to have that among the Reformed, where there's an effort, it kind of fails, and then they pull back, kind of like the Lapland or Servia's early writings here. You're going to see some of that in the Anglican Church as well, and then all three of those branches are going to eventually run into that pietistic movement. So you're going to get the Dutch Second Reformation and the Reformed churches. That'll trickle back down into Geneva, up into Scotland. You'll get the Puritan movement in England, which is going to then produce the missions work, like the Mayhew brothers in Canada, and Brainerd and Eliot, and Eliot and Edwards and Brainerd eventually in America among the Native Americans. And so you're going to see that emphasis in missions coming back. The one difference is and actually this would parallel kind of the Danish Hala mission. You have the King of Denmark wanting missionaries to go, and in England you're going to have a lot of the colonial charters including missions as one of the purposes for the colonies. And then they're going to establish the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. They had all those nice long names for their missionary societies early on. And even the initials were long. But you have these different missionary organizations that are going to be on about par with the Danish Hala mission. They're going to send out a few dozen missionaries ultimately. Some of them will be more about publishing Bibles and other things and getting the Bible into foreign parts. But it's really the rise of pietism takes the government, the societies that have been produced are fed by the pietistic movements in those different branches of the Reformation, and that's where the missionaries come from. And then about 1800, about the time we run into William Carey and his ilk, you have the awakening, you have the revival movements that are going to come from. So it's kind of you have the societies and the pietism work together to send out the initial missionaries. Those stories start coming back, the revivals come in, and then you have the boom of missions in the 1800s, which really explodes all the way up until, to some extent, the present day, but especially 1800s to the early 1900s. And I'm sure Dr. Patterson covered that very well and thoroughly during those different times.
That's helpful. And this is just obvious, but my brain went right over it. Obviously, Whitefield Wesley, that represents that, right? I mean, it's kind of the pietistic movement pushing against a little bit the Anglican staid simple formula. So they're kind of poking at they're prodding the Anglican Church, and yet they regard themselves as basically Anglican all the way to the end of their lives. But what they're doing is essentially missions, particularly North American missions. But but the results of that spreading broadly across North America, especially for Wesley and so forth. Yeah, that makes sense. That's helpful. That's good.
Yeah, and the neat connection there with the Wesleys is the pietistic emphasis in the Anglicanism then runs into the pietism of Germany with the Moravians, and you have this combining there on that boat to America, and that kind of a perfect storm. And then Whitefield has the pietism of England, but he's much more heavily influenced on the Reformed side of things as well, and some of the influences from the Dutch Second Reformation attaching to him. And so really you have all these different pietistic movements with coming together, and you get Great Awakening and Second Great Awakening event. Well, the Great Awakening, and all the different aspects in England, in the United States, in Americas at the time in different spots. I would say that, I would say a love for Christ and a compassion for others, which is kind of a cop-out because those are the two great commandments. But when you see those two things actively taking place in the church, you will inevitably find productive missions work. I'd maintain that Christianity, rightly understood and rightly practiced, is always missionary. When there is a right understanding of Christianity and a right practice of Christianity, that you will have strong home missions and you will have international missions taking place, to the extent that it's possible. I mean, there are people in our churches that will never have the opportunity to go across the seas to foreign missions, but if they have a true love for God and Christ, and they have a true love for their neighbors as themselves, then they're going to be sharing the gospel somewhere. And I think the Reformation brought a strong love for God back into a dead church, and that there was that was the impetus for much of the theological work that happened in the Reformation, and that there was still a love for others as well there, but the pietistic movement really brought that more strongly to the front, which is why the missions grew more fruitfully during that period, and God allowed the environmental factors to be mediated to some extent as well. I think he does. It's been a long time since I read that book. And I think he plays off of the expect great things, attempt great things comment by Carey. Or is it, that was what he initially said. I think it came down more, the editors changed it to expect great things for God, attempt great things for God. Because that was implied in what he was saying. But that idea of God is doing something. In fact, I'm one of the project I'm working on right now here at work is a church history Sunday school series, 2 13-lesson Sunday school series on church history. And when we were working out over the title, which is always the hardest part of a book. I don't know why. It's like 6 words on the front of the book, but it's the hardest part. What we came up with for the title for both books it's called God's Prevailing Work. Just the concept there that the church is evidence that God's work continues throughout history. God is doing something, and we had the privilege of being involved in it. That's part of our joy of being a follower of Christ, is that we're part of his church and part of the work of his church. And church history should encourage us in that. Even when there are flawed individuals and flawed movements, there is a great opportunity for God to do a work with flawed people, because then God gets all the glory for it. I mean, you look at Luther, and Luther is, as an individual, Luther's kind of a mess. And he flip-flops on the Jews. One minute he's writing that they were that Jesus himself was born a Jew and that they're wonderful, and then 15 years later he's writing a letter saying that they should drive the Jews out of all Protestant lands. You see him, if someone wronged Luther, they were blackballed for the rest of his life, and you couldn't get back on Luther's good side if you got on his bad side. And you read about that, and those aren't necessarily things you read in your general survey, but if you spend any time on an individual, you're going to find those flaws in them. And yet God uses those flawed individuals to accomplish great things. There's one of the missionary history books that I've read, From Jerusalem to Irian Jaya, I believe it's called. The author in there, she seems to delight in finding those black marks in missionaries' lives, like the things that they did wrong, which can be discouraging. But as I read that, I think, wow, yeah, these were messed up people, but God used them in pretty great ways. And when I see the Reformation and I see the lack of world missions, or even the opposition to it, I don't think of don't necessarily think of that as I see God still working in spite of that, and prepping and preparing them, and keeping a few voices there to keep the idea of world missions alive, so that when the time comes and the theology gets fixed and the emphasis is there and the opportunity is there, God continues his work, which is really encouraging, because all of us are messed up people. And I know how flawed I am, and seeing church history just reminds me that God still uses flawed people. And I think all of us can take some heart and encouragement from that.
Which really fits and extends beautifully the way that we ought to be reading particularly our Old Testaments, but our entire Bibles. That, we do the moralizing thing. We find, a nice character, a nice story, and what we pull out of that is, here's the 4 principles for success or something, or 3 principles for how to handle conflict. And when you actually look carefully at these biblical characters, even the ones that we hold up highly, David, Abraham, you find out these are really messed up people. But the proper processing of this is just to say that Scripture honestly records their huge faults and then points us to say, and then God did something extraordinary. We do the same thing then with church history when we want to sanitize everything. But I actually, what you said, I like that I'd rather read something non-sanitized to remember that these are regular, normal people. When we just had the anniversary of the Reformation, there were some books around kind of the thing that we desperately need today is another Luther. And, I want to say, no, we don't need another Luther. We just need somebody alive today who's going to walk with God. And that's all of us. Let's walk with God. But we don't need another Luther. He was good for his time. One was enough, and we can move on,
And I think that's the danger of church history. One of the dangers of church history is that we find a period of time or a person that we read about and we really like. And we think to ourselves, if we could just get back to the Reformation, or if we could just get back to Calvin, or if we just get everything lined back up with this. And that's not the way God builds his church. Those people were God's people at God's time, God's movements at God's time. We learn from them, but we don't want to go back 500 years. We want to be where God has us and doing the work God has for us, and acknowledging the flaws of the past, rejoicing in the victories, and knowing that the present has the same flaws and victories for it.
That's a great emphasis. Is it reasonable or fair? Let's say we have this effect when we go way back to the fathers. We've had this discussion about baptism of the church fathers, and there's kind of this fuzzy line where it's not clear that they've worked out baptismal regeneration entirely in their minds. Anyway, there's some complexities. Let's say complexities. But we look at some of that and we say, well, if you were just handed the New Testament, you work it out without any systematic theologies or any, it's just, there's so much for them to process at once. So obviously they didn't get everything right. You try it. And is that a fair thing to put here too with the Reformers? Some of their missteps, I guess, like Luther's missteps with the Eucharist and stuff like that. Well, okay, we can criticize them, but you try working out everything and reworking all the data in just the short period of a lifetime and figuring it all out and not making any missteps. Is it fair to put missions in that category here that, okay, this is a misstep, but look where they started from. And so they got the most important things right, justification by faith, grace. They got, the sola scriptura, the other solas, they got the core stuff. Okay, give them a little time, give a generation or two. Is that a fair analysis here?
Absolutely. And again, one of the lessons of church history is graciousness and patience with others. That, as much as it's encouragement to me that other people mess up, it reminds me that I need to be gracious to the other people when they do have struggles, both historical people and modern day people. And we are encouraged in that direction. And like you said, I'd much rather the reformers get the solas figured out and then do missions than to do missions and then get the solas figured out later. That's what the Jesuits did. I mean, they never figured out the solas. So, I mean, they jumped right into the missions stuff without having the theology straight, and it did not turn out well. So
That's great. Great emphasis here. Any parting shots? Anything you want to, a grenade you want to toss on your shoulder, over your shoulder on the way out the door or anything?
no, I think I tossed most of them that I wanted to there, but keep reading and read church history. It's great stuff. And as you can, work it into Sunday schools or sermons and things like that, because your average person in the pew is not going to know much of any church history unless the pastors and the leadership in the church bring it to them. People aren't just walking around picking up church history surveys on their own. So
that's great. Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your time, sharing your work in the form of the dissertation that we have there. Just a final passing encouragement. If you didn't read it, go hit the chapters that he recommended, chapter 2 and 3. And then, I mean, there's more there, but it's a great read. It's nice. It's enjoyable. It's good writing. So anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Harris, for your time. Really appreciate your efforts here.
Well, thank you all. And it was a blessing being with you this morning.
Thank you. Parting comment as we go. On Tuesday, I'm excited about looking into what I had mentioned to you before. This is Justo Gonzalez's History of Theological Education. And so I'm going to give you a chapter. I'm going to give you the concluding chapter. It's the best chapter. And then I'll do the other sections. But if you'll read that final chapter, it's going to help you think through even how to implement some of this. It's really practical into ministry. And it's not just for educators. It really is all the way through church ministry and so forth. So I said Tuesday. That was a joke just to see if you were paying attention. But anyway, I'll see you on Monday. And thank you very much all for being here tonight. We'll look forward to seeing you on Monday. Yes, on Monday. Okay. Dr. Harris, thank you again. Have a good night.